They never saw the moon that night. Only the torches lit one by one on the hills, as if the entire horizon suddenly decided to open its eyes. The fortress of Kalahizer perched on a rocky spur in eastern Anatolia. It had withstood attacks 100 times in the past. It was said that its walls were so thick that a cannonball could get lost within them. It was said that its inhabitants were born with a sword in their hand. People were saying a lot of things, but that night, nobody said anything anymore. The captain, Armin, his face covered in dust and sweat, he ran along the ramparts, shouting orders that were carried away by the wind. Beneath him, the entire valley shone like a serpent of fire. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers advanced silently, disciplined, menacing, their shields forming black scales that swallowed the light. "They are coming from 3 sides," a lookout yelled. "Hold on. We won't give in." "Not before dawn," replied Armin. But he knew that dawn would change nothing. The Sultan had sent one of his best armies, not to besiege, not to negotiate, for to race. The first shock was not a sound, but vibration, as if the stone beneath their feet were quivering. The enemy trebuchets, lined up in the distance, had begun to speak. A heavy, steady, almost calm rumble, then a second, then a third, until the sky seemed to bend to the rhythm. The projectiles struck the walls like giant war drums. Armin leaned over to observe the inner courtyard. Women, children, and the elderly were crammed into the cellars, their hands trembling. Soldiers were distributing water and the remaining arrows. There was enough to last perhaps 8 hours. 10 if a miracle decided to fall from the sky. But the sky remained silent. At midnight, the first breaches appeared. "Captain," shouted a young soldier, his eyes wide, "I see. Gather everyone. We'll defend to the last man." When the enemy finally launched their assault, it was like a rising wave, inevitable and monstrous. Grappling hooks caught on the stones. Ladders came crashing down. The defenders repelled first 1, then 2, then 3 ascents. But each time they drove back one group, 3 more climbed. Iron met iron. The screams tore through the air. The ground was covered with helmets, shields, and crushed torches. Armin himself found himself surrounded near the great tower. He fought until his arm burned and his fingers clenched around his sword like claws. He saw his men fall one by one. He saw the fortress banner shattered, trampled, buried beneath the invaders' feet. And he saw, for the first time in the 30 years he had lived within these walls, the inner doors shatter under the enemy's pressure. The fortress had fallen. But hell, it was only just beginning. The Ottomans did not celebrate. Not yet. They had not come for a trophy, but for a message. A punishment, it was said, for the entire region that refused to bend the knee. Selected units advanced through the corridors, lanterns in hand. With almost ritualistic precision, the aim was not to loot, not to burn, not immediately. It was a Buddha bring the fortress to its knee so that history itself may never forget. Armin, captured, was dragged before the officer who commanded the assault. Pasha Kamal, a man with neatly trimmed black beard, whose eyes resembled cold stones. Kalahizer resisted, said the Pasha, without raising his voice. "She will resist again," replied Armin, despite the blood flowing from his temple. "No, she will learn." And with a gesture, he signaled. The soldiers lit torches, not to set fires, but to reveal which was about to be done to the survivors. In the inner courtyards, in the great hall of the castle, in the dungeons, all those who were still alive were gathered together. The screams began, not cries of death, cries of terror. Because everyone understood that the Ottomans had not come to kill, they had come to break. And what happened until dawn, no one could ever tell the whole story. Neither Armin nor the women hidden in the cellars, nor even the victorious soldiers. For the night became a heavy, suffocating secret, from which even the stones seemed to want to turn away. The sun rose like a red veil, timid, embarrassed to illuminate what remained of Kalahizer. The Ottomans advanced into fortress with almost ceremonial slowness. Flames still burned in places, but no one attempted to extinguish them. The enemy's soldiers walked silently among the rubble, as if the night had transformed them into specters. Pasha Kamal, standing in the center of the large courtyard, observed the assembled survivors. There weren't many of them, but they were alive And that precisely was what gave the fortress its new face. A marked, emptied, broken face. Armin, his hands tied behind his back, stood among them, his head bowed. He had almost no voice left, not because of the blows, because of what he had seen. All night long, the Ottomans had not sought death. They had been looking for the total submission to a punishment that left no visible marks, but changed the people forever. The families had been separated, lined up, interrogated, humiliated, forced to renounce their symbols, their songs, their weapons, their very memory. Clan leaders forced to prostrate themselves. The young warriors were forced to lay down their arms before the invaders like beaten children. The women gathered together, not to be hurt, but to be made witnesses. Witnesses to complete moral collapse of their fortress, orchestrated stone by stone, spirit by spirit. Nothing bloody. Nothing spectacular. Nothing but the shadow of humiliation, deep, methodical, calculated. The Passion knew that this type of night would survive in all stories, would become a dark legend, a nightmare passed down from one generation to the next. And that's exactly what he wanted. When he spoke, the survivors held their breath. Ewell Livy said calmly, he waited. The sentence carried weight. You will live to tell what we have done here. He took a step towards Armin. Not what you imagine, not what you fantasize. No, you will recount the erasure. He placed his hand on the captain's shoulder. An erasure is worse than destruction. Then, with a wave of his hand, he ordered the doors to be opened. The survivors were sent back to the valley, not in chains, not escorted, free to leave with their memories, free to transmit fear. Armin walked last, his step heavy, his heart stifled. Outside, he stopped and turned around. The fortress of Kalahisa resembled an empty shell, its soul stolen during the night. The captain then understood that the battle had never been about the walls. She had been for the identity of an entire people. And that identity, that night, had been brought to its knees. As the survivors descended the slopes, an eerie silence reigned, and no sobbing and no shouting. Only this terrifying feeling that the world had just been turned upside down. A few hours later, the smoke began to rise. The fortress was finally burning. The Ottomans had waited until the survivors were out of sight, so that the flames would not be a spectacle, but a curtain call. Armin closed his eyes. He knew that Kalahisa would never be rebuilt. He also knew that the night they had just lived through would become a story, then a legend, then a curse whispered in hushed voices in the mountain villages. A story that no one could ever tell completely, because there were no words to describe what the Ottomans had actually done that night. Only a silence that haunted the air. A silence unspeakable.